Paul Chaat Smith, a member of the Comanche Nation. He's an author, an essayist, and associate curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. His work focuses on the contemporary landscape of American Indian politics and culture. He is the lead curator of the lead exhibition that is getting ecstatic reviews, so if you haven't had an opportunity to view it, well, that's on you. He is the author, with Robert Warrior, of Like a Hurricane, the Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, and Everything You Know About Indians is Wrong. Among his many honors in 2005, Art Papers named him one of the 25 most respected contemporary art curators working today. Please welcome Paul Chaat Smith.
Thank you, Michelle. Hey, everybody. I'm always amused by the assumption of so many friends and allies that Native Americans are inherently progressive. In my experience, Turtle Island has always had a wide and stubborn streak of small c conservatism, and especially in more recent decades, plenty of hard-right politics as well. And I don't mean some complicated indigenous version or something ironic. I mean as plain as a red baseball cap that says, "Make America Great Again." Hint, some of those people wearing them are Indians. Or tweets and Facebook posts from my Comanche relatives that make pundits on Fox News sound like European social democrats. Those tweets would shock everyone in this room, and I say that because they shock me, and I'm pretty used to them. I'm not suggesting this is a majority of the Red Nation, just that it is far more than a fringe element and way more than the number of hard-right African Americans. An awful lot of Indians live in red states and, big surprise, share similar cultural and political sensibilities. More than a few tribes, especially ones that produce coal, gas, and oil, cheered the election of President Trump. A few weeks after that unforgettable November evening, the host of Saturday Night Live, surrounded by the cast, waved goodnight wearing a Stand with Standing Rock t-shirt, which she pulled on for emphasis as she exhorted America to, well, stand with Standing Rock. Everyone cheered, as nearly everyone always does in those moments. America loves Indians. And for the vast majority of Americans, loving Indians comes at no cost. The crisis over the pipeline that became, briefly, and it's always briefly when it comes to Indians and national attention, was in truth deeply complicated with many players and interests, lots of history, and mind-numbingly intricate politics. When I watched that moment on SNL, I felt pleased with Kristen Wiig's gesture. Right on. Well, I didn't say it out loud, but I felt it just the same. I was happy that so many Native people and non-Native people, or at least the non-Native people that didn't insist on bringing their own drums to North Dakota, pledged solidarity with the water protectors. What is always fascinating to me is how immediate and certain Americans are, particularly white Americans, about which side they are on. No hesitation, no sense of, well, I wonder if I should study up on this, learn more about it before taking a position. Nope. I'm packing the minivan tonight and driving north. The genius move by the activists at Standing Rock, one they learned well from Ames' occupation of Wounded Knee a generation earlier, is that even the most cynical, hard-bitten elements of the public and the news media can be guaranteed to swoon before a feathered Plains Indian on horseback. Works every time. Like AIM, the water protectors were not very focused on organizational protocols or vetting. Pretty much everyone was welcome. Compare that with Freedom Summer in 1964. First off, wild horses couldn't have dragged most Americans to even consider joining that party. For good reason, Freedom Summer was insane. It was a certainty that you would face violent attacks and that you would risk death. A popular joke going around in SNCC circles back in the day went like this. A Boston Seminary student is wakened at 2 a.m. by a heavenly voice imploring him, "Go to Mississippi, go to Mississippi, Go to Mississippi. The seminary student answers, Lord, you said you would be with me always, even until the end of the earth. If I go to Mississippi, will you go with me? The heavenly voice replied, I'll go as far as Memphis. It was insane, and those insane people who went couldn't just go and volunteer like at Standing Rock. They had to pass rigorous tests and all kinds of vetting to prove themselves worthy of getting beaten up by racists. I always loved that about SNCC. They made membership in their ranks as rigorous as becoming a Mercury astronaut. AIM was different. AIM was like, come one, come all, come on down, which is beautiful and stupid in equal measure. And relevant to our discussion this afternoon, AIM was originally focused on challenges faced by urban Indians. It was created 50 years ago this year of so many mostly sad anniversaries. And among those were police brutality. One of AIM's earliest initiatives were police watch programs, inspired with the Black Panthers, the Black Power activists had done on the West Coast. And yet, though genuine connections did exist between the civil rights and later Black Power movements and the Indian movement, they were fleeting and rare. The most significant connection was simply the example of African American activism and intellectual and cultural production. The importance of that to every single marginalized group seeking to challenge power in the United States cannot be overstated. People like Richard Oakes and Vine Deloria Jr. and Clyde Warrior pay close attention. One of the most noted examples used in promotion materials for this event is the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. True, Indians were involved, but not very many, partly because the timing was bad. AIM was just being born and wouldn't reach its zenith for another 5 years. You might say AIM was always late to everything, and you wouldn't be wrong. I hear the Blacksonian has an excellent exhibit about the Poor People's Campaign in Resurrection City. Haven't seen it yet because I'm waiting for the crowds to die down. But there were always problems with this grand alliance. One was that Indians bristled at their movement being characterized as a civil rights struggle. It was no such thing. Indians, we argue back then and still argue today, are not just another ethnic minority group, but the only group in the United States with a distinct legal status that goes back to the Constitution itself, a kind of sovereignty. So, from our point of view, our cause was not about equal rights under the Constitution, but fair treatment under the terms of treaties and other agreements made between the United States and Indian nations and communities. And sadly, this is when people start backing out of the room when they realize this is getting really complicated and they've got someplace to be tonight, so bye. And I wish there was a way to get across the idea that it's not always our fault if it's complicated. We try to make it simple, but the truth is sometimes things are just really complicated. We're sorry. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm saying this idea of a splendid, deep, and powerful alliance between the black and the red is nothing more than a white liberal fantasy, because that's not my point. My point is, yes, it is mostly a white liberal fantasy, but there's more to it than just that. Like, history. I used to like history, or thought I did, and sometimes I still do, but most of the time, no. Most of the time, history and I are frenemies at best. This has been especially true lately. Don't know if you guys have heard about my new exhibition, Americans. I'll pretend Michelle didn't talk about it, so I can talk about it now. For those of you that have been living on the moon, it opened 4 weeks ago today. The LA Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Post, The Economist, BBC America are all saying it's the bee's knees. And if you haven't seen it yet, you should duck out after my presentation and check it out. 3rd floor. We have this section called Trail of Tears. The interest is heralded with the words, not what you think, not even close. The Americans exhibition sees removal at the center of a profound and massive reshaping of nations and economies. With the final barrier of intact indigenous nations removed, the Cotton Kingdom and the enslaved laborers needed to run it exploded. We also point out the Removal Act was narrowly passed after an authentic debate in which Native leaders and civic organizations had agency and voice. In other words, we respectfully dissent from the popular idea it was all about me and Mr. Jackson. Removal was a cruel and disastrous policy, one taken with eyes wide open after a fair and vigorous national debate. And we further argue that while, of course, the US was not a true democracy in 1830, it was nonetheless the truest and most advanced democracy at the time. And the removal policy did much of what it promised. Not the part about implying removal would be voluntary, not that part, but the part about bringing wealth and power to the South came true. Soon, the richest Americans had zip codes in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. New England got rich too, as did England. It reshaped economies and borders, and we argue, can be considered the most significant event between the Revolution and the Civil War. All of that wealth, impossible without the enslavement of 4 million human beings, led to the catastrophic and bloodiest war in American history. So when we pitched this, everybody loved this version of Trail of Tears. Bigger and badder and way more consequential. But here's the problem. If this larger view of Trail of Tears says it was a reason for the explosion of the Cotton Kingdom and slavery, and let's remember, just a few decades earlier, abolitionists thought they were on the verge of winning, it meant we couldn't ignore the fact that those famous 5 civilized tribes were slave states themselves. And this is when, curatorially speaking, history isn't a frenemy anymore, or even an enemy. History becomes a mangy, snarling dog, standing between you and your cozy home with a burning fireplace, dinner on the stove, and a crowd-pleasing narrative. Obviously, this story should be, needs to be, that the enslaved black people and the soon-to-be exiled red people would join forces and defeat their oppressor, or at the very least, rise up and kick some ass. That's what the story should be. That's what I need the story to be, and that's what my public needs the story to be. But the mangy, snarling dog won't stand down. If I had a shotgun, maybe I would shoot it, but I'm not a dog killer. So the mangy, snarling dog of history is the irrefutable historical record that shows the 5 civilized tribes were deeply committed to slavery, established their own racialized black codes, immediately reestablished slavery when they arrived in Indian territory, thus expanding slavery in what became the United States, rebuilt their nations with slave labor, crushed rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Civil War, with the Confederacy in the Civil War. Do you want to hear that? I don't think so. Nobody does. I miss the 70s. Remember back when Afrocentrism was in full bloom and black kids were being taught that the ice people and the fire people, about the ice people and the fire people and how the Egyptians invented the airplane? Well, we had a similar jam going, and in those days, here's what we said about Indians being slave owners. First, it's all a lie. Second, we later admitted, well, there was some of that going on, but actually those weren't Cherokees or Choctaws, they were white people pretending to be Cherokees and Choctaws. And I remember hearing another iteration that says, sometimes we pretend we own slaves just to protect our brothers and sisters from the slave catchers. I like that one a lot. In later decades, it was admitted that, okay, some Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek Seminoles did own slaves, but it wasn't really the same as when white people owned slaves. It was a kinder, gentler type of thing. And anyway, there weren't many people who did this at all. Parenthetically, of course, most white Mississippians didn't own slaves either. So these were the kinds of things we were saying into the current century. My favorite version, which this museum and many others have relayed, is what I call the Samsonite Narrative. And this focuses on the Trail of Tears as a place to admit there was slavery going on. And in careful, studied, neutral, and boring sentences, think the iTunes end user agreement, describes how some of the tearful exiled Indians owned slaves and brought them along with other possessions on the death march to Indian territory. Interesting, but not really. Pay no attention, nothing to see here. And listen, if I thought I could get away with it, I might have tried, but the Samsonite narrative just wasn't going to cut it for the Trail of Tears, not what you think, not even close narrative, which says removal was a key factor in the explosion of the Cotton Kingdom. So yes, we went there. We call the 5 civilized tribes slave states. And it's a good time to point out that in case anyone thinks I have it in for the Cherokee, they can consult texts I've written about the Comanche that are much, much worse than anything I'm saying here this afternoon. So here's what I think. I think we can't find common ground if we're stuck in the quicksand of provably false narratives. And as I'm sure everyone here has noticed, the United States has been involved in a constant and robust debate about the Civil War, the likes of which haven't been seen probably since, well, the end of the Civil War. At the center of that debate has been the physical artifacts, trophies actually, of the genius marketing campaign called The Lost Cause, those ugly statues that litter whole regions of the country. To their credit, the Cherokee have never downplayed their role in fighting for the Confederacy, so they have their own Confederate memorial in Tahlequah, which does make it awkward to participate in national conversations about this great reckoning and what to do about Confederate memorials. While researching Americans, I discovered a thrilling account of how the Cherokee Nation's top leaders, including John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, staged a brilliant campaign in 1832 to win the support of abolitionists, even as the abolitionists were upset that both men, and really pretty much the entire class of the ruling class of the Cherokee, were slave owners. Ridge and Boudinot lied and obfuscated and promised to quit running ads for escaped slaves in their famous newspaper, The Phoenix. In the end, they kept the support of William Lloyd Garrison. And it becomes obvious that the Cherokee saved their alliance because the white supporters rationalized that the Cherokee would eventually give up slavery, but weren't there yet. In other words, they couldn't really be expected to make the same moral choices as a white man. And of course, the justification for removal to Jackson and others was eerily similar. Indians were okay, they just needed a few decades to catch up. They weren't equal. Meanwhile, Boudinot and Ridge were laughing their asses off because they played their allies without their allies even knowing they'd been played. As Natalie Joy explained in a 2010 essay, abolitionists believed, as did most Americans, in the myth of the noble savage, whose innocence of civilization was the source of his virtuous purity, but also his greatest weakness, for it left him vulnerable to the introduction of unwanted vices, including, in this instance, slavery. Moral responsibility could only be expected of fully civilized people, not partially civilized Indians. Anti-slavery reformers latched onto this theory, for it not only explained how Indians became slaveholders, but offered hope that with time and under guidance of missionaries and reformers, they might progress enough to abandon civilization's vices. Partially civilized Indians might be slave owners. Fully civilized Indians would become emancipators. And of course, what was really happening is that Ridge and Boudinot performed precisely as capable and highly motivated national leaders should, making arguments and deals that advance their interests. Their goal was to prevent removal and to steady a key alliance with abolitionists in the Northeast. Like skilled diplomats the world over, they did what they had to do, which in this case was to tell big fat lies about Indian slave owning. So when I think about the versions of this history I've learned over the past decades, the justification for making something plain as day, that Cherokees and others owned slaves, complicated and mysterious, has the same root as it did in 1832. That is, a desperate search for some alternative explanation. The Cherokee owned slaves for the same reason their white neighbors owned slaves. They knew exactly what they were doing. And to their credit, when they weren't spinning lies abolitionists, they were remarkably consistent. John Ross said many times that slavery in his nation was a settled question. At the root in denying this is a belief that the Cherokee are not fully human and not capable of making conscious and intelligent decisions to advance their interests. All right, it gets worse, but I'm almost done. That mangy dog. He's got a new friend in the form of those annoying DNA kits everyone in the country is getting. My in-laws are African American, and like pretty much every African American family I've ever met, they are sure they have Native American ancestors. My wife's parents were college professors, so of course it wasn't just some folk tale, it was a very specific name and a date written in a family Bible. They were pretty certain this was legit. So the test comes back. Well, everybody here is smart, they know DNA testing, there's no categories race, et cetera, but it's still not completely worthless, okay? Just algorithms, et cetera. Anyway, the test came back and it said two of my sisters-in-law they each had their usual 20% something European ancestry and 0% Native American. Skip Gates has been saying this for years. I don't know why, but I always hate it when he's right. And there was a New York Times article last summer that reported a recent study, first time looking at large numbers of these results, said that Black Americans were running at 0.8% Native American ancestry. So now we have the undeniable truth of powerful Indian nations being deeply committed to slavery, allied with the Confederacy. Also, some of them denying Black members of their tribe's citizenship for like 150 years, and African Americans starting to realize that the Native American ancestor in their family tree never existed. Awkward. Don't blame me. This is not the narrative I want either. None of this is good. History is awful. I may have mentioned this. It's a mangy, snarling beast, probably rabid. I hate that dog so much. But it's not all bad either. It was cool to think the Egyptians invented the airplane, but when we realized that was just a fairy tale, we moved on. And we are better people for moving on, smarter people, tougher people. So we'll get through this too. It's a quirk of human nature that for one side to be good, the opposing side must be bad. The 5 civilized tribes weren't that complicated. They were willful and determined oppressors of blacks that they owned, enthusiastic participants in the global economy driven by cotton, they believed they were equal to whites and superior to blacks. They were also oppressed and terrorized and exiled by a government of white people who saw them as inferior and in the way. Because Jackson was bad, we need John Ross to be good. I don't know why our brains make it so hard to compute that Jackson had a terrible Indian policy, and he also radically expanded American democracy. Or that John Ross was a skillful leader for the Cherokee Nation who fought the criminal policy of removal with every ounce of strength, who also deeply believed in practicing enslavement of Black people. In my projects, I'm always pushing back against the idea that we are better than our ancestors, and if we were around in 1832, we'd make all the right choices. I doubt that. Because what I've learned from the mangy dogs of history is that nothing is black and white. The world of 1832 was just as complicated as it is now. And we shouldn't be so quick to assume we'd be on what we grandly call the right side of history. The common ground we seek is not a pre-existing condition or a birthright. It is something that must be won. I conclude with a throwback quote from a 1970s African revolutionary named Amilcar Cabral, who offers some useful advice. "Tell no lies," he said, "and claim no easy victories." Thank you for listening.
Maybe Mr. Smith will come out of his shell someday and just really break it down for us. That was Paul Chaat Smith, the lead curator of the NMIAI's new exhibition, Americans.